Hi, everybody. I'm Lisa Plaggemier, the Executive Director of the National Cybersecurity Alliance, and this is Data Privacy Week. And right now we want to talk about considering privacy and in diversity and inclusion initiatives. I'm joined by three very esteemed women in the field. Would you please introduce yourselves? Let's start with you, Ruby.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ruby Zefo. I'm Uber's first Chief Privacy Officer. I've been working most of my lengthy legal career in-house, and I came to Uber after 15 years at Intel Corporation to help it mature its practices and get it ready for IPO. But I'm still here 3.5+ years later because I love my job. Thanks,
That's
Lisa.
Great. Michele.
Hi. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Michele Gilman. I'm the Venable Professor of Law at the University of Baltimore School of Law. At the law school, I direct the Saul Ewing Civil Advocacy Clinic, which means I'm supervising students who represent low-income clients in a wide array of civil matters, from housing to consumer to public benefits to workers' rights. And it's in that context that I come to data privacy issues. Over time, I'm seeing more and more the ways in which different data-centric technologies are impacting low-income Americans. And that is a great deal of my research focusing on that issue. And I look forward to sharing some of those findings with you today.
Great. We're happy to have you. And Mary?
Hi, thank you so much for having me here today. I feel like at this point I'm a Data Privacy Day alum because I was trying to think about how many events I've participated in over the years, and I think this might be number 5, but I'm not sure. It's a pleasure to be here. I am currently an affiliate at Data and Society, also a senior fellow at the Joan Ganz Cooney Institute in New York. So I sort of wear 2 hats. I have my privacy research hat and my youth and public media hat these days. I came into this work originally when I was at the Pew Research Center, studying Americans' attitudes towards privacy and how they were changing over time. That is when I applied for a grant to do a project where I asked Michele to be on the advisory board looking at the privacy experiences of low-income populations in the US. That led to several law review articles and several articles later, one of which we'll talk about today. But again, looking at this intersection of how low-income Americans experience privacy differently.
Well, thank you for joining us. Really happy to have all 3 of you here today. So Mary, as you mentioned, back in April, you and Michele shared your research report, Digital Barriers to Economic Justice in the Wake of COVID-19. You identified 3 major digital barriers to economic justice arising from the pandemic. Can you talk about what those barriers are? Would you share those with us today?
Sure, thank you. And just to give a little background context, this report really builds upon previous research of ours that was looking at digital inequalities and what we refer to as the matrix of vulnerabilities that low-income Americans face. So this is a combination of sort of realities in their experiences, attitudes, historical discrepancies, and disproportional surveillance of these communities. And what happened in terms of our thinking and in terms of feeling as though there was a need to do this work is that basically as the pandemic and the scale of the pandemic came into focus, we became increasingly concerned that there was sort of this emergency mindset emerging in the midst of this global health crisis, and that this would have the potential to create a new rationale for expanded surveillance in a range of areas. And this increased data collection and some of the associated markers of economic distress could further exacerbate inequalities. So the barriers that we look at in this particular report are first, this collapse of benefits automation. I think we all saw various aspects of the dysfunction that played out associated with the digital distribution of benefits. And that really preceded the pandemic, but again, was exacerbated by it. And so we talk about in this report how the distribution, in particular, of unemployment insurance associated with the CARE Act was an absolute nightmare for low-income Americans. Websites crashed, Many sites were inaccessible on mobile phones, which we know in many cases are the primary devices that they access the internet from. And then in turn, also in-person offices that might have served as a stopgap were closed. And so as a result, by some estimates, over a third of UI applicants were unable to file a claim because of these technology failures. And many found the process too complicated to even attempt to access benefits. Then as a consequence, without these benefits, these workers experienced food insecurity, missed credit card payments, and in some cases, the loss of their homes. So this was a sort of the foundational, a very important shift that we saw. Related to that, we also look at sort of this expanded network of surveillance, particularly in workplaces and in educational settings, where we saw a greater burden placed on low-income people who oftentimes were among the first to return to work and in school in person. So for instance, we saw in dozens of districts across the country, students were encountering what were essentially experimental and unproven health-related surveillance practices, such as the use of thermal cameras, facial recognition, and associated disciplinary uses when they weren't complying with things like wearing masks or other protocols. And in terms of the ways in which some of these legacy systems were being adapted, this was something that was happening faster than our ability to sort of understand the long-term impacts. And finally, the third area that we look into is how all of this digital profiling, in particular, any markers of economic distress, are potentially going to be folded into people's data profiles in ways that affect them long-term, access to jobs, to education, to other economic access. And so these are things like evictions, unpaid credit cards, shut off utilities. And so, we can, and I know Michele can talk about what she's seeing in her practice, but essentially what this results in is an increase in the barrier to achieving financial stability after all of this hardship. And so I think from our perspective, we're concerned about the ways in which some of these data-driven decision-making systems are not necessarily recognizing the exceptional vulnerability of these communities at this time and how some of this can be exacerbated with the pandemic.
Yeah, a lot of well-intentioned programs with unintended consequences. Michele, the report also talked about things that you see in your legal practice. Can you discuss those a bit more with our viewers?
Sure. So during the pandemic, I became very concerned with two of the trends impacting low-income people that Mary already touched on, but that I'll expand on a bit. And I think these are important for businesses and corporate America to understand as well, because when we're talking about low-income populations, we're in many cases, we're talking about your consumers and we're talking about some of your employees. So first, as Mary mentioned, I'm very concerned about the ways that economic hardship during the pandemic is being encoded into people's digital profiles in ways that can trap them into poverty going forward. So for instance, in my law clinic, we were representing a family that fell behind on their rent when the father lost his job in the food service industry due to the pandemic. And we were able to help this family take advantage of the eviction moratorium, which put a pause on evictions nationwide. But the moratorium didn't cancel rent. It just pushed the balance due forward in time. And it's pretty clear that this family will never be able to fully catch up on their rent, which, ended up in the tens of thousands of dollars. In the meantime, they were missing utility payments. They were amassing credit card debt. And all of those indicators of economic hardship, they're data points, and they're permanently in my clients' digital records, which, have been scraped by data brokers and other industries that amass consumer data. And in turn, this is going to make it harder for them and other folks facing, these similar problems to get new housing. It can impact whether people will be hired for a job, whether they'll be able to take out loans, and if so, what they'll pay for it. And as a society, we need families who were pummeled by the pandemic to have a fresh start. And yet, this big data ecosystem that we are all in makes that very difficult. The second trend relates to the crash of automated systems for public benefits, as Mary mentioned, particularly the unemployment insurance system. Here too, I think it's important for corporate America to understand that when their employees were laid off due to the pandemic, the safety net that was designed to provide support during times of economic calamity utterly collapsed. So state systems, they couldn't handle the millions of claimants that were flooding into the system. There were millions of people who waited months for benefits, and many are still waiting and have not received them. These families are suffering in all the ways Mary and I have talked about: evictions, unpaid bills, and the like. And as these families have come back to work, it's important for businesses to know that this transition has not been seamless for so many people. They are still digging out of an economic avalanche. And there's another lesson in here as well that I think applies in the corporate context. Many of the problems with these automated systems were the result of human underinvestment. So the people power that is needed to support automated systems and to ensure that they are operating fairly and accurately just wasn't there. Adopting automation can be a great tool, but it's not an excuse for firing staff. It just doesn't work on its own. And many of the systems were designed without the needs of low-income people in mind. And here too, I think, again, there's a lesson for corporate America. Many of the platforms were designed with the assumption that people are accessing the internet from computers as opposed to smartphones, that they have access to broadband, that they speak English, and that they are digitally literate. Okay, that could be true of software programmers, but it's not always the case with low-income populations. Many of my clients, they were struggling to get online at all. If they could get online, instructions were too complicated. They struggled to upload documents. Sometimes they struggled to set and reuse passwords. And so if these automated systems had been tested on the actual populations, and if stakeholders were able to provide input, so many of these design problems could have resolved at the outset before they were able to cause harm. And so it's a powerful lesson that design justice really matters. Whether you're a government agency or a business engaging with consumers, you simply cannot assume that everyone engages online the way that you do. And so I'll stop there for now.
Those are some really good points, Michele. There's an awful lot to think about there. Ruby, in Mary and Michele's report, they also discussed the framework of data justice and the idea that technology can serve to empower or oppress. Can you give us the business perspective on that, please? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I will give you my business perspective. So I want to take a beat to take a step back behind the technology. Data is not the only oil that runs the digital economy. It's still people. And I'm not talking about numbers of people staffing things. I'm talking about the people who design systems. People can serve to empower or oppress, and people create and use technology, which can also empower or oppress. So if that's true, then society has certainly had, tech failures, and it's very important that those are fixed. But that doesn't mean we should just demonize all of tech in general, which I hear a lot about, well, tech companies do this or tech companies do that. Well, we're talking about millions of companies. And so lumping it all together doesn't help us dig out a proper solution. So I would say, a kitchen knife is a handy tool to cut your carrots, but it's also a murder weapon in the wrong hands. So we need more fiduciary duties on companies on how they use the tech. We need better design. I don't believe all tech is evil. I don't believe tech should be banned. I don't even believe specific tech should be banned. I respond that almost anything is evil in the wrong hands, used for the wrong purpose. So we should be focusing more on that. And I like to dig into details to find out what exactly is the problem and how do we fix it. If the sole purpose of a technology is to do something bad, then yes, we should be banning it. But that's rarely the case. Usually we're worried about a use of the technology that offends our general common ideas of a just society, or that isn't working correctly and desperately needs to be improved. And that's why we're hearing about some of these terrible, well-intentioned but bad impacts on the people we've been talking about, on underserved communities who already have it hard in general, and certainly during COVID. So if you're worried about what law enforcement will do with a certain technology, then create requirements that they can't use it for that. Because you don't want to extinguish the very good innovations and things that can be used by this technology in the right hands for all the right reasons. So I believe the key to fostering innovation is doing it in a way that requires the results that come out of it to be appropriate and anticipated, and not create inequitable or unjust impacts, which can be done, particularly for people that are already from these underserved communities. So that's sort of the foundational way I sort of think about these things. And I try not to overgeneralize, because, you know, I work at a company that cares about this and is trying to do it right. And so, you know, I like to really dig down further into determining what these problems are and the root of them, so that we can do something about it.
Yeah, that's a really good balanced perspective, and nothing is ever as clear cut as it seems on the surface. So really important.
It's very complicated.
It's complex and complicated. Yeah. So let's pivot a little bit and talk about DE&I initiatives. There's some obvious privacy implications with those programs. Again, well-intentioned programs that may have unintended results. Can you share your thoughts with us on that, Ruby?
I can. You know, it's very important to respect people's privacy, even when your intentions and goals are pure and good. And I do think that this gets lost. It's possible to make big mistakes here. So you have to bring the people you are trying to serve into the initiatives, not only to make sure you're focusing on the right things, because your idea of what they need may not be correct, which we already heard Michele kind of allude to, but to get their permission to have their identities tied to these well-meaning initiatives. And in other words, I mean, you can't serve particular communities if people don't want to self-identify as belonging to those communities, because they don't want to participate for good reason, or they're afraid of what will happen with the data once they're associated with it, or their choices for how to identify themselves aren't accurate or inclusive enough. And when you're talking about identities, it's already so complicated, because our identities, they're both contextual and fluid. My identity, well, right now, today, I'm a mom, I'm a divorced singleton, I'm an attorney, I'm a rabble rouser, a shenanigans instigator, I'm a cocktail creator. I mean, pick one. But our identities change over time with our circumstances. They may come naturally, or they may be curated by us for different audiences. You see what I want you to see here today. And if you add intersectionality to all of this equation, it's even more complicated, because you may be forced into some kind of binary or priority system where your identity is in fact not binary and it's fluid. Are you black or white? Are you a woman or a man? Are you, prioritizing gender over race, or vice versa, when people are all of these things? And these various identities invoke all kinds of DE&I and therefore privacy topics, because of the intimate relationship between identity and privacy. I mean, after all, privacy is also highly contextual and means whatever each person thinks it means. So the answer is not to be the benevolent dictator and force people into uncomfortable choices. The answer is to invite them in with transparency and a good value proposition, so that they want to participate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's complex for sure, but just that act of sort of inviting people in and being inclusive at the outset can be a struggle. It comes down to, I think, having people with really good soft skills involved in those initiatives to craft that language and be as welcoming as possible and as inclusive as possible, and then letting people make their own decisions.
Right, and having people who this is their expertise. Our HR business reps, they deal with this stuff all the time, and we bring them in all the time. And I run the Women at Uber ERG, and we work so closely with our DE&I people to do as best we can on getting these things right.
Mary, one additional part of the DE&I pipeline involves increasing diversity in the academic programs that educate future employees. Can you talk about how the increased surveillance of students during the pandemic could affect those goals?
Yes, and I apologize for the loud noise in the background.
That's okay, we can't hear it.
This is my home studio where, yes, many exciting noises can emerge. Yes, so, I think it's really interesting to think about how these threads dovetail. And I know we're kind of threading the needle on this, right? But they do actually affect one another. So in terms of, again, thinking about the sort of bird's eye view of how Michele and I are thinking about these long-term impacts, we're really, concerned with the kinds of data, and in particular, either data that is inaccurate or data indicators that are temporary, like temporary financial distress, but then get sort of assigned to people's, profile permanently. And so, like, one of the big problems here is that everyone, not just low-income people, everyone has really a lack of agency in their ability to correct mistakes and right wrongs, right? But we know that the more you are burdened with the realities of living in financial distress, the less likely you are to be able to have the resources and time to pursue correcting some of these things. So when we look at what's happening with students, both in terms of virtual schooling, sort of the abrupt transition to virtual schooling, and the ways in which that has by default resulted in both an enormous amount of monitoring through the systems that are just being used by default, but then also specifically around proctoring, around tests, affecting both things like, assessments of students, ability to stay on task, their assessments of whether or not they're cheating on an exam, and their agency to challenge this and the accuracy of these assessments. That's one area that we are concerned, was rolled out very quickly. There was, this very lucrative marketplace emerged for these tools. A lot of, schools and other institutions, even in workplaces that were looking to monitor employees, would deploy these tools and without being overly concerned about either their accuracy or the ability for students to challenge them. We know that a lot of these tools tend to have, error rates that are much higher on people of color. We know that, something as simple as, Ruby was talking about how personal and contextual privacy is, being a student and feeling as though you are constantly being monitored, constantly being assessed, and then, also having to deal with potentially errors in those assessments and not being able to challenge them can be extremely discouraging. And so if we're thinking about fields where students are, going into either, having to make a significant leap from high school into a college, atmosphere, or in college, in tough classes where they're trying to, say, pave their way in a program that's a technical program where they are in the minority, this kind of reality, while it may seem small or minor compared to things like, simply falling very ill or not being able to afford college, all of these indicators do affect a student's ability to feel as though they are succeeding and successful. And it largely does also contribute to the mental health burden of being a student during this pandemic. So I do think about those pipeline challenges as it relates to just, thinking about your next generation of employees, both what's important in terms of how you structure assessment, how you examine and give applicants and students the ability to explain circumstances, how you create other pathways and partnerships to encourage students to see themselves in these professions, and also help to raise awareness that some of these tools that proclaim to increase efficiency during this time may actually be quite problematic.
I think that people are too precious to have good, talented people fall through these types of cracks. Especially in this job market, you know, there should be opportunity for everyone. And so to see talent at that age in college fall through cracks like that is really, you know, at the individual level, tragic for those lives, and at the macro level, you know, not what our economy needs or our society needs right now. So Michele, one of your arguments in the report is that if technology is not advancing the racial and economic justice of all Americans, it requires regulation, retooling, or retirement. And I think this has been something we've heard reflected from everybody on the call today. So what sort of recommendations do you have to enhance economic justice?
Sure. Well, as Ruby talked about, technology has incredible potential to be empowering, to be innovative, to contribute positively to society, but that doesn't happen by accident. We have to be intentional about it. And so in our report, Mary and I honed in a sort of 5 broad recommendations sort of at a society-wide level that we would like to see all the different stakeholders engage in. And the first, we've touched on a bit today, is that technology design and technology access should really center the diverse needs, interests, and experiences of users. And this points to the importance of DE&I initiatives that we're focusing on today, and having workforces who are designing and implementing technology represent the society at large. You know, I found some data that the combined Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous workforce in Silicon Valley firms is about 5%. That's very low. We know women represent less than 1/4 of technical jobs in tech, and their numbers drop even lower in leadership positions. And these disparities do result in part from the pipeline problem that Mary just so eloquently talked about. We know that employers consistently prefer to hire and train workers who replicate the existing workforce. But there's also an endpoint problem that we have to be attentive to. We know that women, Black, and Latinx workers who obtain tech jobs leave them at much higher rates than white men. And the reasons vary. It could be harassment, lack of mentorship, sense of exclusion, sense of disrespect. And the narrow worldview, if we only have programmers who represent one slice of society, has consequences, right? You know, as I talked about before, if designers are imagining their default users, they're gonna oftentimes just imagine themselves, and they're going to assume a level of privilege that doesn't exist for all users. So that's our first broad recommendation. Second, we feel that the entire onus to protect personal data shouldn't be on the consumers and users themselves. The institutions that benefit from our data should also have responsibility to limit the harmful impacts of automated decision-making systems. We want to have a better sense of shared responsibility throughout society. Third, we want stakeholders included in decisions to adopt data-centric technologies in the design process, ongoing monitoring throughout the entire implementation cycle. Our fourth recommendation is that really when we're focusing on core human rights, housing, education, healthcare, employment, we really need to have a commitment to the values of transparency, accountability, and fairness, and they should be mandated and not optional. And fifth and finally, because of our focus on the pandemic, we really urge that pandemic-related debts, evictions, other indicators of economic hardship be expunged from digital profiles wherever possible. And it's very American to believe in a fresh start, right? To give people the idea of constant reinvention. Sort of as Ruby talked about earlier, each of us is always constantly reinventing ourselves, and we shouldn't be digitally trapped into ways that keep us from limiting our human potential and our autonomy. So those are our 5 broad recommendations, and there are a lot of, you know, ways that they can be implemented, but those are our core commitments.
Those are great, and I encourage everybody to if you weren't jotting notes down quickly enough, to take a look at the report yourself, because I think those 5 really boil it down, and those are great. So Ruby, just building on those 5 recommendations, where do you see further opportunities here for further equity and fairness?
Yeah, Lisa, there are so many opportunities, but that means you have to actually take steps to do it and not just talk about it. For example, Uber published anti-racism and equity initiatives and hired an inclusive design team, and we reach out to underserved communities to actually hear about what issues they're having on our platform and about their experiences and what we can do better. So we're trying to fight racism with both technology and people. And for example, I listened in on some diverse groups who volunteered to give us their feedback, and it really helped me to better understand their challenges. So how to better serve these various communities, that's also very personal and very contextual depending on the service you're talking about, which it does make it hard, and there are no standards to design to, right? But that doesn't mean we can't do anything, because I could say the exact same thing about privacy reviews. In fact, Uber's beta testing our privacy impact assessment tool right now to see if it can be reused for our inclusive design team reviews, so that submitters who have a new project that might be impactful in both of these areas can submit it in one tool. So these are the ways we're trying to find to actually get things done. We also have data scientists who help us look for patterns and impacts, right? Data science, go get a job in data science if you don't know what to do. Privacy, data science, security, we're all here needing more people. Please, please come. So in the end, it comes full circle back to people, because how we, the public, are treated by people who are marketing to us, employing us, servicing us, selling us things, or as we started this discussion, even surveilling us, can impact our identities and how we define ourselves, and also misidentify and incorrectly profile or define us in ways we don't want. But all is not lost. The intimate relationship between identity, privacy, security, DE&I, equity, it means that privacy and security pros, who I hope are watching this right now, are well positioned to be advocates for equity and fairness, particularly for vulnerable populations, while we use our expertise to judge products, services, and programs in our wheelhouse for data privacy and security impacts. So I encourage privacy and security pros to educate themselves and their companies more deeply on how we can all service equality and fairness better beyond our traditional roles. And it starts with maintaining broad diversity in our own cross-functional teams. So we're doing our best to avoid blind spots in our own products, services, and processes.
Yeah, that's right. We can all absolutely make individual differences that all add up. We have a few minutes remaining, so I'm going to put you ladies on the spot today. It's still early in 2022. So give me one prediction in the world of privacy for 2022, something that you see coming on the horizon, or and maybe we can lean into some optimism, and maybe it's a prediction that we would like to see come true. Maybe we're
well, now you've done it.
Yes, asking privacy and security professionals to be optimistic is always a challenge. I'm well aware of that, but who wants to go first? Mary, I'm going to pick on you. You're still on mute.
Okay, yes, being optimistic is not something.
What would you like to see happen? What one thing would you
good
like
at
to see
these
happen
days?
in 2022?
But when I put my future hat on, which
Yeah.
I'm often doing when talking to young people in the other side of my research life these days, I think a lot about not only what it means to have a digital profile, but to actually a future in which each of us will be more fully digitally rendered in these spaces in which there's so much buzz talking about the metaverse, right? Which on the one hand has not yet been fully realized, but on the other hand, when you look at the ways in which young people are so deeply and socially invested in online spaces, particularly online gaming spaces, I'm the mother of 2 teenage boys, you can see the ways in which there is an alternate digital economy. There is, the majority of their social interaction outside of school, especially during a pandemic, is happening in these spaces. And so I am thinking, a lot in this year, how we're going to shift our perspective around what has been a relatively flat understanding of privacy, right? I mean, our our law has a long way to catch up with where we're going, and thinking more about how the online ecosystem is going to change, and our sense of what kinds of information and transactions and value play into this whole data privacy conversation. I think it's going to be evolving pretty quickly.
It's exciting and terrorizing at the same time. Yeah. Michele, how about you?
Sure. Well, as you know, I'm a practicing lawyer. And so what I'm hopeful about is that more privacy legislation will be passed that gives people more control over their personal data and a better understanding of how it's being used. You know, and my prediction is if Congress can't agree on comprehensive privacy legislation, the states are going to continue to pass more and more of this as the laboratories of experimentation that they are. And, you know, as a lawyer, I would like more legal hooks so I can help my clients if I think they're sort of being ensnared in data processing systems that harm them. And I hope that as these laws are drafted and get passed, that they incorporate civil rights norms into them, and that we're very attuned to the risks of digital discrimination, and account for those and provide more accountability and transparency around that. You know, I know that the public is increasingly demanding more control over their personal data. I think there's a lot of public support for this. There are obviously sticking points that are, you know, keeping Congress from crossing the finish line on it, but it'll happen one way or the other. And it's just essential. It's really, really important to sort of get rid of the sort of Wild West situation we have there and have some agreed norms and values as a society.
Yep, we completely agree with you. Yeah. Ruby?
Yeah, so I'm not holding my breath for federal law this year. You heard it here first, but
okay.
When I look backward at the horrifying last several years we've had in a history of the world of horrifying behavior, I do think we've sort of reached our limit in some ways where people are finally getting more mobilized than they were before. So what I'm looking forward to, whether it's in a privacy law or somewhere else, I do think we are seeing much more calls to action on more fair and equitable ways of treating people. And that can crop up in all kinds of different ways, both in a myriad of different laws. I mean, we've seen the GDPR impacting a lot of laws outside of just privacy laws, for example, but also just people's behavior, right? We've still got to get better on anti-racism and things like that if we really want to make a just society for people. And I do think that we're fed up to the point where the torches and pitchforks are finally coming out in more ways with more people. And that's what's going to influence a broader scope of things that really need to work together to really help the people who need it most. And also leveraging existing laws we have now. We don't need a new law for everything. If you incorporate new technologies into the impacts that existing laws are supposed to, you know, equal justice laws are supposed to do to be serving our community. So that's more about what I'm looking forward to, but that's just a much broader inclusivity, you know, viewpoint that I'm hoping that keeps building over time.
We'll try to end on that note of optimism. I want to thank you all, Mary, Michele, and Ruby, for joining us today. This was a great conversation. I hope the audience enjoyed it as much as I did.
Thank you. It was really great being here.
Thank you, Lisa.